Welcome to this video podcast on what your legal responsibilities are as a horse owner. Now, let me give you a scenario. I pulled this from a legal paper titled Horseplay Gone Wrong, a proposed model Equine Activity Liability Act that was published just a couple years ago. And this is a common scenario played out around the world because when we look at legal responsibilities for horse owners, while specific laws are going to differ from country to country and even region to region within those countries, there are some general themes that you need to think about, and we're going to discuss those today. Outside of equine liability, then we also have other laws, which we're going to discuss here in a second. But let me give you this scenario. Typical riding ranch in Wyoming. So in this paper, they said Eli is a riding instructor at Buckingham Ranch, located in Wyoming. He spends his days at the ranch conducting lessons for horse riders of all skill levels. He is aware that Wyoming has an Equine Activity Liability Act, or an EALA, which is common in the United States. 48 out of the 50 states within that country have equine liability acts or laws. Okay. He also recognizes that the Equine Liability Act purpose is to protect equine professionals like himself from being held liable for the injuries incurred from the inherent risks. So, inherent risk is something we're going to discuss in more detail of participating in equine activities. Okay, so Eli understands he has some protection, right? Some, not full, some. Okay, in this scenario, Eli meets Harry. He's a new participant at the ranch. Shortly before their first scheduled riding lesson together. Now, part of Eli's job as a riding instructor is to match the rider with the best horse, all right? And Harry told Eli that he had previous experience with horsers and he wouldn't consider himself a novice. Shortly into the lesson, it becomes clear that Harry lied about his skill level. He is a novice and he said he wasn't. He fell off when the horse reacted to a loud noise. And then Harry, in turn, was injured and sued Eli and the Buckingham Ranch. Now, is that the legal question is that a inherent risk of being bucked off a horse? Well, in this scenario, the ranch was actually found to be liable. So was Eli. That as a instructor, he should have taken more precautions to evaluate Harry's ability before he put him on a horse that he probably couldn't handle. So maybe should have started him on a bomb-proof, easygoing horse, then prove himself, and then gradually move him up. So you would think falling off a horse, you say, hey, I can ride, no problem, tons of experience. Okay, well, I've got a horse that, is moderate to maybe a little bit more difficult. And you put someone on there without evaluating them, you could be held liable. And so it could lead to issues down the road. Now, at the end of this podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about insurance because you should have equine liability insurance. And I'll discuss that, how much it costs and why you should have it. But really, the majority of this podcast, we're going to talk about these equine liability laws, what they are, how they differ from, say, the United States to Europe, to Canada, to down to Australia. So we'll look at different regions, but there's general themes throughout. Then we'll look at some other laws that you might not be aware of. So it's just outside of equine liability. It could be some other things like just today, as I record this in 2024, Germany changed their animal welfare laws, and it is making waves across the world in the equine industry, where you cannot now train a young horse in Germany from age 1 day old to 3 years old. You cannot train that horse no matter what. You can't do groundwork. You can't introduce them to a saddle. You can't do anything. So I'm going to explain that a little bit later. What's the news? What's the reaction to it? And that is huge. And that's a change in the law So you have to be aware that these laws are changing all the time, and you have to keep abreast of them. So we'll address that a little bit. But to start off, the Equine Liability Acts, or laws discussing inherent risk. And I'm going to look at the United States first because that's what I'm most familiar with, but the themes are similar in other countries, as I'm going to show you here in a minute, or discuss in a minute. So I found actually a very, very good equine law blog. It's actually called, quote, Equine Law Blog, out of Foster Swift. So I would highly suggest, if you own a facility, you own horses, you ride horses, train lesson riders, go read that blog. Look at all the different issues and different lawsuits that are going on around the country, at least in the United States, and then, obviously internationally, if you have an interest in that. So on this blog, I found what is an inherent risk with horses. And like I said, 48 of the 50 states in the USA have Equine Activity Liability Acts. Now, the wording differs from state to state, but they do, again, share those common characteristics. Now, to explain this to, say, an international audience, in the US, you have the federal government, federal law, and then each state has state laws. In other parts of the world, a country like, say, Canada, the provinces all have different laws. Here in Australia, across the ditch in Australia, each one of those territories have specific laws to their territories. So even though in the United States there's 48 different EALAs, they all are pretty similar, and they all talk about this inherent risk. So what is an inherent risk with equine activities? So this blog went and used Georgia's definition, so Georgia in the United States, the state, and they defined inherent risk this way. It means those dangers or conditions which are an integral part of equine activities, or, as the case may be, a lot of legal jargon, including but not limited to, so equine activities, the propensity of the animal to behave in ways that may result in injury, harm, or death to persons on or around them. Okay. So the inherent risk, the propensity of the animal to behave in ways that may result in injury, harm, or death. Okay. And also property damage too for some of these. So we know riding a horse can be dangerous. It could lead to, just like driving a car, those types of activities could lead to death, right? So an inherent risk when you get on a horse is knowing, well, I could get hurt. So if I'm jumping fences, if I'm participating in certain events, when I do that, I'm accepting there's a risk there. Okay. And if I got hurt because the horse is being a horse, or I fell off because of my own volition, not because I was paired with a horse way too much for me, but just doing a normal, even on a bomb-proof horse, they can still get spooked. They can still act up. So that's an inherent risk with that. Okay, B, going further into this law, the unpredictability of the animal's reaction to such things as sounds, sudden movement, and unfamiliar objects, persons, or other animals. So again, an inherent risk is a horse reacting. They are reactive. They are a prey animal. So they do react to, different sounds. Anybody that's ridden knows that. My early days, I still remember this because I almost fell off. It really scared me, but it showed me that horses can spook under saddle. A plastic bag rolled on the ground and the horse I was riding freaked out. And this was a bomb-proof horse. I mean, I was a novice. This horse was soft as can be. And it just startled and turned real quick, and I almost fell off, and it scared me. So that's an inherent risk. That's horses being a horse. Okay. Part C of this law says certain hazards, such as surface and subsurface conditions. Okay, let's just talk about icy roads or icy trails. A horse may slip and you may get hurt. That's an inherent risk. Okay. Collisions with other animals or objects. Again, inherent risk, trail riding through a forest, you can, get knocked off by a branch or, horse into a tree, things like that. And then the final part was the potential of a participant to act in a neglectful manner that may contribute to injury to the participant or others, such as failing to maintain control over the animal or not acting within his or her ability. Now, I know I opened up with that example of Eli and Harry, but Eli should have known better. There was some negligence there in his approach to matching a horse with the rider. So, in a court of law, with a jury of the peers, they could win that lawsuit, right? But if he put him on a bomb-proof horse and could sit there in court and say, I put him on the safest, softest horse we had. We've never had issues with this horse. And say Harry got on and spurred the horse on or did, something to really agitate the horse and hurt himself or hurt somebody else because of his neglect, then it wouldn't be on the ranch. It would be on the rider, right? So that's where these laws come in to protect you and your facilities and your businesses. Now, let me give you some examples of where inherent risk came into the courts of law in the United States and cases were dismissed. And the defendants, the horse owners or property or whoever it was not held liable. So in Ohio, a horse's reaction to a dog which jumped at the horse's back legs, so a dog attacking a horse, was deemed an inherent risk. So the rider got injured, sued the person that owned the horse, didn't win that lawsuit because of a dog. That's horses being horses. Again, you assume that risk when you get on that horse, right? In Indiana, getting trampled by a loose horse at an event was an inherent risk of equine activity under Indiana's EALA. Just in a recent audio podcast I did about calm horses, I told the story when I was at the Del Mar racetrack, and I was holding one of our horses that had just come off the cool down, and we were bathing them, and I felt a brush of wind against my back of my neck, and I looked, and a 2-year-old horse had gotten loose from another barn and ran right by me within inches of me. That horse could have ran me over. It was spooked. It was scared. It could have killed me. But because I was working at the racetrack, because I was, that was a risk I took, and horses can get loose, right? And that's part of the risk that I assumed with that job. So anyways, similar, and that was held up in a court of law where no, sometimes they get loose. And if you're participating with them, you could get hurt. In Kentucky, a horse spooked from the sound of an opening gate. That was an inherent risk. In Texas, a horse spooked during a trail ride, riding across muddy and swampy terrain. So slipped, fell, hurt the rider, and rider sued and lost. In Texas, again, a horse's violent reaction to the bite from a fire ant was deemed an inherent risk. Little ants in the southern United States, they're nasty, and they sting. And so the horse reacted. And Wyoming, the risk of a saddle slipping during a trail ride was an inherent risk. So again, you probably need a good lawyer there where, make sure the tack was appropriate and, but they argued, look, sometimes saddles slip. It just does. You know that if you worked around horses. But I'll give you a warning because I did take some law classes back in the day, and I did take a class on torts, which is where these lawsuits reside, injuries, and some of those, multi-million-dollar settlements that you read in the news. Because my professor at the time was a judge. He had practiced law for many decades, and I remember him telling us a good lawyer can argue almost anything and win. So I'm not trying to fearmonger you. That's why we have these laws to protect you, but that's where insurance is really critical, so you don't go bankrupt and lose your business. But just be aware, some of this is gray areas. And to give you some examples, just 2 examples of where the trial wasn't, or the trial was not dismissed, or the complaint was not dismissed, and it went to a jury. In Wyoming, a court found that a trail ride staff alleged failure to saddle a horse with even stirrups was an issue for the jury to decide whether it was an inherent risk or not. So that could be some negligence there, right, on the people running the trail ride. So that's where the jury would go and decide. In Hawaii, this one was interesting. Whether a plaintiff's injury from a horse bite during a trail ride was caused by an inherent risk was considered to be a question of fact for the jury. So there again, that gray area, the people probably leading the trail ride. Imagine in Hawaii, they probably run a lot of different trail rides in the beaches and the hills. Maybe the horses weren't appropriately spaced out, and another horse turned and bit the other rider, and then they sued. And the jury went to decide. I don't know the facts of all these cases. This is just off that equine law blog. But I remember early days when I was a novice and a horse kicked mine because I was too close. And it was just, I didn't know, but it could have been my teacher was letting us all bunch up, and you got to be careful in those instances. So anyways, that was back in the day. But we do have these equine liability laws that are in place to protect you because of this inherent risk in the United States. And now let's look around the world. And I wanted to start with the European Union. So a bunch of countries, and generally when you look at the EU, they all have commonality with inherent risk. So just to summarize that, the EU, it varies between member countries, but the common principles are the same. Generally, the EU countries impose a duty of care on horse owners and operators, and liability is often based on negligence. So again, that's what tort law and stuff comes in. We're negligent. If I know we make mistakes as humans, it's part of our nature, but either it gets into like willful negligence where you knew it was a problem and you did nothing about it. That's where you get into real trouble. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Speak to any lawyers if you do need legal advice, but just from my understanding, negligence is the big one. And then liability insurance is commonly required in EU countries if you own horses, and cases often hinge on whether the horse owner took reasonable steps to prevent accidents. So it's that reasonable. That's where lawyers come in and argue whether it was reasonable or not, and whether you were negligent, willful negligence, and stuff like that. So that's where it gets like, it can get scary for you if you are sued. Now, the UK is no longer part of the European Union, and the UK law, and my basic understanding of it, is they do have acts, and then many of their laws are based on case law. So they go back and look at precedents, and then they evaluate on that. So then Commonwealth countries like where I'm at, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, others are similarly based like the UK law. So that's why I wanted to cover this one. Now, when it comes to horses or equine activities, a lot of it's based in their United Kingdom Animals Act in 1971. And the act holds that the keeper of an animal is liable for any damage it causes under certain conditions. Specifically, liability can arise if the damage is due to a characteristic of the animal that's not normally found in animals of the same species, or only found at particular times or under particular circumstances. And the keeper was aware of this characteristic. I'm thinking of, for me, it's dogs. If you have a really vicious dog and you keep it, this is where it's like, okay, you know it's vicious and it hurt somebody, you are definitely liable. With horses, very rarely are horses that aggressive. I've only run across one in my career, and I've worked with hundreds of horses, many universities, massive herds. There was only one horse at one university that was hyper aggressive. He would try to kill you if you entered the paddock or pasture. And so we rehomed the animal. and found somebody that could care for it. It was a gelding. It wasn't a stallion because you have to be very careful around stallions. But this was just a horse that had trauma and needed to go to a new home. But horses can get out, or they're inquisitive, or, so you've got to take steps to confine them. And to carry that on, there was a case. It was Merva versus Henley in 2003. And the House of Lords in the UK established in that case that the keeper of an animal, so this was a horse, could be strictly liable for damages that resulted from behavior which was in no way abnormal for an animal of that species. So their Animal Act was, if it's abnormal behavior and you know about it, the House of Lords said, hey, that's normal behavior for a horse, but you're liable because it caused damage. So what happened was the case involved the defendant's horse escaped from the field, resulted in an accident with the claimant's car. And so they sued the horse owner. The horse owner was found liable because the horse got loose. Now, it wasn't willful negligence. The horse could jump fences. Some horses know how to undo latches and locks that you may not be aware of. And in this case, it's the horse jumped the fence, I believe, if I remember right. And people were very, very concerned that this would lead to an increase in claims under the Animal Act. So it did. It raised awareness. More people sued. But here's two examples of where they said, wait a minute. Sometimes there is this inherent risk with equids. So two notable examples. There was a lawsuit in 2012. The claimant was thrown off a horse while she was testing it. She was told by the seller that the horse required an experienced rider. So she was warned, you need to be an experienced rider to get on this horse. And the claimant said, okay, got on the horse, fell off and got hurt and sued. But the court decided that riding it anyway, despite the warning, the claimant had accepted the risk involved. All right. So some common sense. Then in another case, Freeman, this one was in 2008. The claimant hired a horse for a hack. She was an experienced rider and fell off when the horse bucked twice before cantering. The claimant knew what risks she was running, and they said that's an inherent risk of equestrian activities, so you don't have a claim. Okay. So that's at the UK. If we go to Canada, their equine liability laws are governed by, they do have federal, so the federal government in Canada, and then the different provinces. So Ontario has specific legislation that addresses equestrian activities and limits liability through the recognition of inherent risks. They also say liability waivers, which I'm going to discuss, and insurance are crucial components of risk management for horse owners and operators. Now, waiver enforceability varies. Courts often consider them valid, and they do hold up. So we'll talk about that in a second. But so the equine law in Ontario, I found this from a law firm there, MackenzieLake.com, and equine law, again, in Canada. Negligence was a big one. So stable operators must be especially aware of their legal duties when they invite others onto their property to ride or train. They have a duty of care under the law of negligence to take reasonable precautions to prevent personal injury or property damage. Okay, so you just can't let people go nuts. You have to, carefully monitor activities. They owe a duty of care they owe a duty to take reasonable care to see that people and property are reasonably safe on their premises. So you got to make sure there is nothing negligent, like you got to keep your barn stable and if arena facilities maintained in working order. Ensure all riders are properly supervised by trained staff and providing proper equipment and attire for riders. So going into this, they do state in there, so the Ontario Horse Riding Safety Act specifies safety requirements for riders under the age of 18. So they have to wear a helmet that meets current standards and hard-soled footwear with a heel of no less than 1.5 centimeters and tack properly fitted on the horse. Operators must make this equipment available at their stable, or they can be fined up to $5,000. And it does say all riders should wear that, and I agree too. Heeled shoes and helmets. But that's a law that's specific that young riders must wear helmets, must have heeled shoes. Okay, at least 1.5 centimeters. If you don't insure that, you are liable if they get hurt, if they're under 18. Then another aspect of the law in Ontario is escape. Okay, like in the UK, the House of Lords say, hey, the horse escaped, you're liable. Here in Ontario, it says another legal risk that stable operators should be aware of is the strict liability for damage that an animal commits if it escapes the owner's care and control. So if the horse gets away and damages property, injures somebody, causes a car accident, the owner will be liable to the damages caused. So again, it underlies the importance of maintaining facilities to ensure that your animals are safe and have proper supervision. So again, it depends on where you live and if that's an inherent risk of horses escaping, or like it sounds in this instance, if they do escape your property, you're liable. And for me in the United States, I think of like hurricanes or tornadoes or fires where horses get loose. But you can probably be held liable again. So you just have to be very, very careful with some of this. Again, insurance, which I'm going to hammer home at the end. Waivers. So in Canada, it said it's prudent that stable operators have waivers, that anybody involved in horse activities signs the written waivers, and they voluntarily assume risks associated with horse riding. So they're not, say, in the sense legally binding. And again, this gets into contract law and depends on where you live, but they are upheld in court. So, are waivers legally binding in Canada? When you sign an agreement, you are bound by it whether or not you've read it. With a waiver of liability, it doesn't matter if you didn't read it or didn't know its contents. So long as you sign the waiver, you can be bound by it if the waiver is valid. Validity of a waiver, you need to speak to a legal expert. So if you have a property and you're not using waivers, I highly suggest you do, but speak to a legal expert to have them draft it so it's legally binding, that's valid to protect yourself. In the United States, the signing of a waiver is going to hold up in court as a binding document. Again, as long as it's a valid waiver. Okay. So that's why you want to consult a legal practitioner. What is a waiver? It is a legally binding provision, whether either party in a contract agrees to voluntarily forfeit a claim without the other party being liable. So basically, if you don't know what those are or haven't run across them, it lists things like inherent risks of equestrian activities. And by signing this waiver, you are assuming the risks involved. They're very common in many sports, very common in activities. When I travel and I did trail rides, I had to sign waivers. Just getting in a boat sometimes for a tour or something, you have to sign waivers. They can be legally binding. But again, I would, wherever you live in the world, speak to a legal practitioner or an aide or somebody that can draft it for you. And so it's legal binding, and then you can use it in your premises. Again, just trying to protect you. All right, if we go to Australia, very similar. There's national laws, then state-specific laws. In general, horse owners are legally responsible for keeping their horses contained and preventing them from escaping. But again, waivers are there. There are inherent risks. The key legislation is included in the Civil Liabilities Act and various recreation activity statutes. So while they might not have specific equine liability laws, it is covered under those. And again, it gets to negligence, where if you know that horse is dangerous and you let somebody get on it and they get hurt, that's negligence. And if they can prove it in a court of law, then you'll be held liable. Then when we go to like I said, in the United States, it's from state to state on the equine liability laws, and they do vary. Okay, so that's just that's the big one. The inherent risks versus negligence, and then what you have to insure. Make sure your horses are safely contained. Your facilities are appropriate, especially if you have people that you're training, running riding lessons. If you know that gate is falling off the hinges and you do nothing about it and it falls off the hinges and horses get escape and injure somebody, you could be held liable. Right. So just keep that all in mind. But if you do everything right, they sign waivers, you have a bomb-proof horse with a novice rider, that novice rider gets hurt and they try to sue you, you should be covered, under the Equine Liability Acts or the inherent risks with that activity. Plus you have a waiver. So that's why this is so important. So let's move on to some other laws that you might not know exists. And California is one of the states that doesn't have an Equine Liability Act, but it does have other laws that are quite interesting. And a little bit goes into welfare and animal care. So you do have a legal responsibility, at least in California. But again, depending on where you live, most nations in the world have some sort of legislation that you have to care for these animals, provide for their welfare. And then here's some that gets into a little bit more specifics with horses. So there's the U.S. animal protection laws, and then within California. Now, I found this one kind of made me laugh. Definition of an animal: every dumb creature. That's a quote in California Penal Code 599B. That's how they define animals. Thanks, guys. Anyways, I don't think animals are dumb. Just not human. Well, even though we're animals, right? We are animals. So that can be considered us too. Okay. So that's what they start off with. Then they get into general cruelty. So any general cruelty and neglect could be a felony in California. 3 years imprisonment or a $20,000 fine, depending on the severity, or it could be a misdemeanor, 1 year county jail, and a $20,000 fine. So that's good. Cruelty to animals being transported. Again, that could be a misdemeanor. So trailing horses, hot weather, they need frequent breaks, watering. Just be careful out there. See what the laws are where you live. Again, impounding domestic animals without sufficient food or water, malnourished, or even though your pastures are bone dry, you need to feed those animals, right? You need to provide water. You need to care for them. That's part of horse ownership. So failure to care for your animals, that's another California Penal Code 597.1. And if you look at abandonment of domestic animals, California Penal Code 597S. So people have let horses loose in national parks because they couldn't care for them. If they found it and traced it back to you, you're in big trouble. You're probably not watching this video if you're one of those people. But again, welfare of the animal, right? So that falls under general cruelty. Then cruelty to working animals, more provisions. Interfering or harming working horses. So that's a little bit protection for you. If you're working your horses and somebody interferes or harms them, that could lead to a felony, 3 years in prison and a $2,000 fine. Inhumane treatment of horses for hire. So somebody is on a trail ride and they're abusing a horse. That could be a violation and they could get in big trouble. All right. Then we got into laws specific to farmed animals, and I found these very interesting. Poling or tripping a horse. So for my eventers or jumpers, you might know of this. You probably should. But poling is hitting a horse on the legs as it goes over a jump, making it think it hit the jump due to the pain of hitting their legs as they jump. So it's causing the horse to jump higher. And I actually there's a couple old movies where they actually do this to the horses in the 50s and 60s. So that's illegal in California, and it is illegal in many circles, FEI and others in training. So, but getting the specifics of how we train a horse. Again, I said I'm going to cover Germany here in just a minute, but you know, got to be careful. Soaring, burning horses in our walking horses is illegal in many places. So be very careful. Then tripping a horse is illegal in California. Now I was like, okay, tripping a horse. So in the vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys, they have events where they let the horses loose and they go and lasso their legs and trip them. And it's led to a lot of horrific injuries in these horses. So that's illegal in California. Slaughtering horses for human consumption. Something I might address one day, talking about how horses are slaughtered. But in California, it's illegal. Okay. I know horses are eaten in other countries and cultures, not passing judgment. Just saying that's a law specific there in California. Okay. So that leads me to this new law in Germany. What is going on? And again, not being alarmist, but this law could have huge implications across the world, across the equine industry. We do care about horse welfare. I love them. I absolutely care about horses and horse welfare. I just was at a conference, which I'm going to quote one of the presenters at the conference I was at that I met and talked to, who she's responding to this law. She's out of the UK. This has a lot of people worried because this law was passed not based on any research, not based on facts. I'm sure the intention's good. We want to protect our beautiful horses, and somebody thinking, oh, taking a young foal and training them when they're a baby, maybe that's not a good idea. And they said, yeah, let's put that in the law, when they don't realize that those are formative years. And I could speak a lot on that, but let me tell you what the law was. Okay. So a lot of you can research this, do an internet search, Germany's new equine laws, and you can read all the different news articles and opinion pieces on it. But Germany has ruffled international feathers with its recent introduction of a law that may drastically affect the world of horse sports. The law stipulates that horses under 30 months of age, so not quite 3, but just under 3, cannot be trained for sports, a decision that has caused a stir in the horse sporting community. And that's, okay. So the Federal Animal Welfare Act in Germany was amended to include this controversial rule. The lone exception provided by the legislation is for 2-year-old racehorses, but only after undergoing 2 rigorous veterinary assessments, because 2-year-old horses need to train up to that 3-year, the third year, where that's like they're starting to peak, and then 4 and 5, and then their career goes down, right? This has raised a lot of feathers because the lack of solid evidence backing the age limit in this law, like, people are dumbfounded, because being in this industry for so many years, training young horses, doing research in young horses and how smart they are, not put them through a training program really, but doing some behavior assessments. It's just at this young age, it is, my opinion, again, this is my learned opinion as an equine scientist and educator, you are developing that bond with that human and horses at such a young age. That animal is learning to trust their caretaker. Are there some terrible trainers out there? Yeah, absolutely. They are, right? But I think we've gotten a lot away from whipping horses and breaking horses, right? We are now today in the 21st century with these young foals, developing a bond with them when they're at an age where they can't kill us because they're not 1,100 pounds. They're big. They could hurt us. But when they're young and more handleable, and you start to get them used to us, get them used to touch, get them used to grooming, get them used to picking up their feet, get them used to a halter. And getting used to being led from the left side. So they know when they're in a big adult that a human comes and stands to the left of them and leads them. That is so critical. And so this law takes that away. Then when you look into the physiology of the horse and bone development, that is where it's got a lot of people worried. Because when you look at bone development in a young growing horse, they need that forced exercise so those bones get more dense. And this is backed by research, and they can withstand injury better. So, say for those young thoroughbreds racing or those young jumping horses, these formative years are important to lay down that bone and other things so their bones are more dense. And so it's got a lot of people worried. And so there was a conference hastily arranged in the UK, and it was titled Equine Cognizance and Mental Maturity. What do we know? And many of the people that I just spent a few months ago looking, this was a welfare conference. We were talking about the welfare of sport horses. These are all the experts in the world that came all the way from the other side, all over from Europe. Finland was the farthest, and came to New Zealand. And for 3 days, we talked about welfare in sport horses. These are the people that got together and say, what is Germany doing? What's going on? So Gemma Pearson, Dr. Gemma Pearson, who I saw and met, and I've seen her at other conferences and listened to her talk, talked about teaching resilience at this conference to young horses. And she said, quote, gentle handling from a few days old will help them to cope with stress throughout their lives. There's so many things we can do to set horses up for success in life. And, it's that those critical years for the young growing horse. Vet treatments. I mean, you're talking about not touching them for 3 years. Those horses are going to be feral. They're going to be wild. And we know that is a whole different animal compared to the one that we hand raise and love, right? She went on to say, we know that horses who are bold, which are more likely to touch a novel object, both at 5 months, also at 1 year of age, have better learning ability using both positive reinforcement, but also negative reinforcement of pressure release. So in the mouth and other things critical in riding, training, which is the way we rely on how we ride horses. So she said that if you teach a horse resilience from the start through gentle, appropriate education, they cope when they have stressors later in life. So this law was not passed with equine scientists telling them to. It was passed without any thought to it. Then they talk about physical maturity on thoroughbreds, like especially training. And this clinician, Pete Rasman, said there's overwhelming scientific and empirical evidence that commencing training before the onset of maturity is beneficial for the horse. So, not to belabor it, not to keep going, Germany, in their response, has launched Project Horsewatch to investigate the new law and its impacts, but that won't be released till 2027, so 3 years at the earliest. The concern is, if Germany passes this law, when other countries go, ooh, that's a good idea. Ooh, who doesn't love horses? Yeah, we want to protect horses. What politician out there wouldn't do that? And then you get this law passing in multiple countries around the world, or multiple states, say in the United States, or provinces in Canada. And that is a problem, because that is going to completely change the dynamics of the human horse relationship, from my opinion, again. Waiting till they're 30 months old. Please debate me, podcast at madbarn.com if you disagree, and tell me why, because I really would want to learn why. I've taught and trained a lot of young horses with a lot of love, care, and patience. And I don't see how waiting till they're nearly 3 years old, where they're physically mature or physically big and strong, and then trying to introduce them to all the things that we teach them when they're really young. Trailer loading. I mean, that's something very difficult to train an adult horse that's never, I can't even imagine it. So anyways, Final point of this podcast is how to protect yourself, liability insurance. Now, don't confuse this with equine health insurance, though you can package both of those together. Equine health insurance covers things like colic. You have a colic emergency, your insurance should cover it. Liability covers you if a third party is injured or property is damaged due to your horse. So this is something you want. I don't know. I don't work for insurance companies, but yeah, I have liability insurance on, my house, my animals, all of that, because I do have floater policies in case I'm ever sued. I'm at least covered and I won't go bankrupt. Right. So different plans out there, different companies sell this. Again, depends on where you live. There's farm property liability, private horse owners liability. I saw $150 annual for equine insurance with a $250 deductible, up to $1 million coverage. One was a premium minimum of $250. That's US dollars. So just look where you live, but get it. If you definitely have people coming on your property, working with your horses, you may want to get, you obviously have property insurance, but a lot of property insurances don't cover equids. So check your policies, make sure you're covered. Hopefully I can save somebody some heartache, and your insurance will cover you. But it's something you should have. I just think prevention is worth it. So overall, this isn't to scare you. It isn't to ruffle any feathers, especially with the new laws in Germany. It is to make you aware that, yeah, there are laws in place to protect you, but that doesn't give you free rein. You've got to ensure your horses are healthy, they're taken care of, they're anybody coming on your property is warned. If anybody rides your horses, don't forget those waivers. If anybody's coming to work on your property, don't forget those waivers, and make sure all of your fences are good, your property's good, your stalls are good, all of that. You need to really protect yourself and protect your horses too, right? I mean, that's why you have them. So again, any questions, comments, podcast@madbarn.com. And make sure you hit that subscribe button in YouTube. I know everybody always asks that, but it shows us that, yeah, you're following this content and you want more of it. Okay. And my final piece of advice, when in doubt, speak to a legal expert wherever you live in the world, because I know that we have a global audience to this podcast, and speak with them. How are you covered? Make sure you are covered. Okay. Take care.